So when you're racing, you have to have a different strategy for sprint distance racing versus Olympic versus 70.3, and then obviously in relation to Ironman. So your differences, one of your big differences that change over the course of those races is the amount of carbohydrate that you need to consume. If you're doing a sprint race, so let's say everyone's going to be somewhere around an hour or thereabouts. The benefit of consuming carbohydrate in those types of races is just much more of a central driver. So the amount that you consume is actually completely irrelevant. All you need to do is just splash a bit of carbohydrate in your mouth. That's all you need to do. And there's been a whole range of studies that have looked at situations where they've fed very small amounts of carbohydrate, or they've just had athletes rinse their mouth with carbohydrate and they get an improved performance. So sprint distance racing, don't worry about how much you consume. It's just about getting some carbohydrate in the mouth. So the carbohydrate choice for a sprint distance race is purely sports drink, or you can use another carbohydrate containing fluid. There's actually no need to be consuming gels in a sprint distance race. If you're out there for 2 hours, maybe, but hopefully no one is. When you move into an Olympic distance race, you need to be a bit more aggressive with your carbohydrate choice. So the benefit of carbohydrate or consuming carbohydrate in a Olympic distance race is both a central driver, but it's also important to provide your muscles with an alternate fuel source as well. So typically speaking, for an Olympic distance race, let's say it's 2 hours to 2.5 hours, you want to be consuming roughly 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour. Now, in general terms, for most people, that would be somewhere in the vicinity of, say, 60 to 100 grams of carbohydrate over the course of an Olympic distance event. If you're having a gel just before you start, or if you're having some sports drink just before you start, that's probably considered within race carbohydrate intake. So anywhere between about 60 to 100 grams of carbohydrate will get you through an Olympic distance triathlon. If you roll out to a 70.3 race, once again, it's a longer race, and let's say it's going to take at least 4 hours, if not longer. The amount of carbohydrate that you really want to manage out is how much you consume during the bike section. And typically in those types of races where you're out there for 4 hours plus, you want to be consuming on the bike, just the bike, if you look at the bike in isolation, somewhere between about, it depends on how quickly you're going, but probably 40 to 90 grams of carbohydrate an hour on the bike, right? So if for the fast guys that are zipping through in 2 hours 15 minutes on those electric scooters, they probably want to get through about 150 grams of carbohydrate within that sort of 2 hours 10 sort of minutes when they're out there. And then you might wind that up slightly if you're going to be out there for a longer period of time. And then on the run, you have a slightly different strategy, and you might add an extra sort of controlled amount of sort of 30 to 40 grams in a known quantity per hour of the run. So for a fast athlete that's out there for, say, 70 to 80 minutes or even 90 minutes, they might have a couple of gels with a bit of a splash of sports drink, and that will get them through. If you're going to be out there more towards the 2 hour mark, well then probably 3 gels with some regular intake of sports drink that will get you through. Now in an Ironman, it's a different strategy again compared to a 70.3. So in Ironman, you've got to have a plan for your pre-race. You've got to be really locked in on that. You've got to have a strategy for the bike, and that strategy on the bike will be different to the strategy that you would use in the run. The bike in an Ironman, if you get it right, will be longer than the run. If you're out there running longer than you're cycling, you haven't had a good race, right? No one wants to do that. So for the bike, you want to get through about 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour on the cycle, and a slightly less amount on the run leg. Now, when you're consuming high amounts of carbohydrate, above sort of 60 grams an hour, you have to use carbohydrate that comes from different sources. So glucose and fructose, or dual source carbohydrate, is important when you're consuming high amounts of carbohydrate per hour. Basically, once you start consuming more than about 60 grams of glucose an hour, the transporters for glucose across the gut start to get saturated. So you can't actually absorb more than 60 grams an hour. So the carbohydrate starts to accumulate in the gut. And what that will do is that'll hold fluid in your gut, and you'll start to feel fuller and fuller and fuller, rather than the carbohydrate transitioning easily into the body. So make sure for triathlon you have a strategy, and that strategy changes depending on the distance that you're covering. If you really want to drill in on it, you're best to see someone that really specializes in triathlon nutrition and can provide that really detailed advice that you want to make sure that you get the best out of yourself on race day.